Almost everything we do is powered by data centers. They stay online even when we're not. At CBRE, we know global connectivity is best delivered through globally connected strategies, providing operational excellence at scale. For us, it all comes down to a single focus: uptime. Always uptime. The art of uptime is our vision of the rapidly changing data center facility. We take a practical, innovative approach to your data center's operations, meeting you, your facility, and your organization where they are in the data center lifecycle to get the most out of your facility today while preparing for tomorrow. CBRE's global view, operating more data centers in more countries than anyone, keeps you ahead of what's next.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the 2021 Connect Conference Day 3, brought to you by Broadway Antron and Data Stream partner CBRE. Enjoy the next session.
So thank you and welcome to a panel. Today's panel, the topic is around power infrastructure in the data center environment. But the real topic of today, or the view or the theme today, is it's more around the art of the possible, right? We know Africa is a big target point at the moment for the global players, and how, as data center operators, as a collective, can basically improve, local infrastructure across Africa. We all know that Africa has power challenges, but so does the rest of the world. So really the idea of today's conversation is we've assembled a really good panel. It feels like we've got a really 360 good view. We've got our big tech hotspots or big players in the market on the panel. We've got an energy or a sort of a power perspective, and we've also got an international sort of ISO or a perspective. So I think we've really covered it, really pulled off a good panel. And I'd just like to go around the panel and let everyone introduce themselves. If you just say your name, sort of your position within the business, and what your sort of your key role is, and then we can sort of build it out more in a conversation. So I'll start on my top left, Brendan.
Sorry, Brendan Dysel, head out the infrastructure management team at Terraco Data Environments. The role pertains to the design of the facilities, and then once it gets handed over from a productive point of view or from a production point of view, we then look after the MEP side of things as well.
Okay, Ranjit?
Ranjit Cherikal, I'm the founder of Vicolo Data Centers. We have operations in Kenya and shortly in a couple of other countries as well. I run the business. Thank you for having me.
Mark?
Hi, Mark Acton, based in London. I work with Future Tech as a consultant. I'm a chartered engineer and probably been in this industry far too long. So I know where some of the skeletons are buried. I think particularly in relation to this panel, though, one of the things I've been involved with is working on international standards, ISO standards and European standards as well. So maybe I can bring a bit of an international perspective on this.
Thanks. Tunde?
Hello, everyone, and good day. My name's Ayotunde Koka. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of Rack Center. Rack Center is the largest carrier-neutral data center company in West Africa. And my role in the company, I've been there for over 7 years now, built the brand, the company, the scale. We're currently about 1.5 megawatts of power and growing beyond that in progress to adding 30 megawatts at the location in Lagos in Nigeria. Great to be here. Thanks.
Thanks. And Minnow?
Hello, so I'm Minnow Parsons. I run a company called Master Power Technologies, and we built quite a few data centers in Africa. We've got a few that we're building at the moment, and being part of the African build-out, obviously the power infrastructure challenges that each one have, and I think Tunde, I think you're one of the most difficult environments to operate in, and you're doing it. And I mean, those are typical things that we privileged in SA to have had a history of reasonably reliable grids, but we've learned from Tunde, and I think even South Africa's got its challenges, Kenya's got its challenges, and challenges that Europe and the States don't generally have in comparison. But there's a lot to learn from the UK or from Europe and America. But it would be nice to sit and discuss our challenges we have out to the market. Yeah.
Thank you. And probably that puts us on to our sort of just building out the platform and setting the scene here. I just realized that we got our 3 big players in terms of territory here, and they all very, very unique, right? Nigeria, probably no power. Kenya, all jealous. They got lots of green power. South Africa is supposed to be the London to Africa, but also very intermittent, and we don't really know where we are there. So I just want to go around to those 3 players, right, and just give us a little bit of background on what it looks like in terms of your country, in terms of power infrastructure. I'll start with Tunde, Nigeria.
Yes. Well, we seem to have this sort of narrative around power infrastructure difficulty, and if you look at percentage of power available, it is from grid itself. It's not that high. Percentage availability is one thing. The quality and consistency of power is another, and there's a challenge of making sure we get that from readily available grid power. Other considerations really is, if you have diesel power, we've demonstrated it can actually be reliable and cost efficient to a point of scale. Once you start really getting to that 1 megawatt, 1.5 megawatts, it becomes inefficient. And also diesel, if you look at sustainability, isn't particularly one of the top for achieving sort of green power. So gas comes into play, and availability of gas is very important. And where you have good availability of gas, you're talking about 95, 97 contractual uptime over a period of time, then the demand for your backup, which is diesel in most parts of the world anyway, actually because of speed of spinning up and ramping up as backup power, the demand for that becomes reduced. So that's some of the challenges we have to take on. And we've really built expertise in power, the engineering of power, the maintenance of power as a core competency. You just have to do that, and bringing on board gas power technology, which is much greener and actually reasonably competitive in pricing in cents per kilowatt hour. The other alternative for innovation is hydro. And I do look at, the possibilities of if you could get close to a hydro point, then you tick all the boxes, right? Higher capital expenditure, but on an ongoing basis, it's pretty reliable. But however, on the equator, we have very, very strong rainy seasons, and we have very deep dry seasons. So you have that cyclical availability of hydro. So that broadly paints a picture. We have to make sure that we've got gas available. You've got to make sure that you can engage with available gas supplies and expertise in sort of an independent power sort of provider type of arrangement over a long period of time, and it becomes a way of life until other aspects of power availability improve. One thing I just wanted to highlight finally is this, that we can see that as well as an opportunity in providing data center facilities. Because if power is so readily available, lots of people, companies are just saying, well, fine, I'll just build some data room somewhere, plug it into the power, it's nice and reliable, and that's it. It actually makes the value proposition for co-location much more compelling, an environment where you have unreliable power because it just means people cannot, it's disruptive. So the best thing to do is co-locate so you can have peace of mind. And we deal with all the power demand, which as I said, is a core competency. So it can be turned around into a benefit. And I also hold the view that despite the environment we operate in, it doesn't stop us really looking at everything we can do to have reliable power. Of course, PUE is very, very important. Despite I've worked with Menno on some of the stuff we work on, right? We've got 90% humidity at least. We've got 90 degrees Fahrenheit at least. And we have to figure out how we operate our PUEs of 1.4, 1.3. We have to have sustainability in energy efficiency.
Perfect. Thanks. So if we can just go over to Ranjit, just to give us just a view on Kenya.
So it's interesting today what you say. You do realize that for end users to use your co-location facilities, they also need power. So yes, it's interesting that there's a compelling business case, but actually the utility of computer services in general is undermined by the lack of general power infrastructure in Nigeria, which is probably the biggest handicap in our industry, not having already exploded. I mean, South African colleagues on the call are the big boys when it comes to data centers on the continent, which really shouldn't be the case because you have a bigger GDP, you have a much larger user base. Power is actually a fundamental issue, and it's not a new issue. It's been there for 30, 40 years. That we have not, as a continent, been able to solve. It's with a bit of pride I'd say that Kenya, which has been a laggard in this sort of scene, has actually come out very much on top. I mean, we are able to get to fairly close to 100%, in some months 100% availability at our sites. We use by which I mean from grid power. We are 95% green. And I think the distinction there is that it's not clean, it's actually green energy. I mean, France will say that we have 98% clean energy because a lot of that is nuclear fuel. We are only investing in renewable energy in Kenya. And, in a big way that tells you the foresight of the government, but also one of our largest resources in Africa is indeed nature and sunlight and wind and, hydro. We're also, I guess, in some ways a bit lucky that our consumption base is quite low, that it hasn't really affected us. I mean, we've gone in the last 7 years from 76% green energy to almost 95, 96%, and it continues to grow. We don't invest in coal plants anymore. Every piece of new infrastructure we talk about is either geothermal, wind, power, hydro, and so solar is also a big part of it. We recently did a solar project for our data center, and it is incredible actually what a small solar plant does, which is in our case a 200 kilowatt plant has done for us. I don't go to sleep worried about power. And I think one of the unfortunate aspects is many of our customers haven't realized how green our energy is and where most of that sort of comes from. I do feel that long term, the cost of power is going to be the big discussions for us to be able to accommodate because our economies are still small. And that is not something that I would say that in Kenya we're proud about. I mean, in general, we have seen a fairly steep rise in the cost per kilowatt hour. And I think that in general is probably the only sort of embedded. But I mean, I would say otherwise, the story in Kenya when it comes to power is aspirational for many, many countries in Africa, and it has just happened in the background. I'm not sure it's very specific government directive or its heritage, but it has worked very well for us from that perspective.
Okay, thanks. Right, Brendan, you want to just give a good South African viewpoint there?
Sure. Look, very interesting to see the different sides of the continent. I suppose if we were to compare South Africa, we probably do have one of the more stable grids. But having said that, it's on aging infrastructure. And with the larger demands or the larger data center demands that are coming through, we can't be blind to the fact that there certainly are challenges, just over the horizon. Certainly looking at the industry level over the past few years, I think there has been a decline on industry, which has almost created virtual power from a availability point of view, and that certainly worked in our favor. The big thing going forward, power is a commodity for all data centers, and I think the interesting question here on this forum is, what happens when that availability starts drying up? And to me, that's going to be the key outcome of this discussion today.
No, agreed. So if I just want to go over to Menno for just to sort of give us a nice overview on all these territories. I mean, you see a lot of power infrastructure that's needed for these various countries. Do you see any trends? I mean, are we all installing the same equipment but just using it differently, or do you see a big trend changer in the various three in the triangle? You're on mute.
There we go. Sorry. So basically the three different discussions you could hear are different. They were completely, and still based in Africa and still with similar challenges. And if you look at typically Kenya, where they've done a great job in renewables, but you're looking at, like, in general, if you look at the country, I think they're on 2.8 gigawatts, for example, in capacity. And then you look at Nigeria at 14 and SA at 37 gigawatts. So they, from the scalability and size of each network, offers different challenges. And when you listen to Tunde speaking, ultimately he's talking about diesels and then coming up with more innovative ways using gas to power. Those are because of the challenges that are provided by Nigeria, specifically in the downtime and the quality of the network that they have there, and the availability, quality of power. So you have to basically nearly regen your own stuff, for example. And when you talk about the scale of the DC, where it's situated, everybody wants to start talking about zero carbon and carbon neutral, and you'll be hearing all these buzzwords. Mark, I'm probably bringing up something a little bit early, but that's the buzz in the UK and in the US, for example. Everybody's saying they're going to be carbon neutral and running off renewables in the next 3-4 years to 10 years, for example, and talking about reasonably big infrastructures, for example. And if you look at typically the local guys in SA, Nigeria, and in a lot of ways, Kenya has been sorted out by the utility ultimately, because their whole network has become a great representation of where we'd like to see the world, for example. But it doesn't necessarily mean we each have that benefit to be able to get there very easily. But I mean, the world is talking about solar, wind, etc., and ultimately the most efficient data center is an off data center. You know what I mean? It's ultimately the users of Facebook and the users are killing the play. If you listen to Ian Bitterman speak, and he tells you how the world is eating itself up with data ultimately. So firstly, the most efficient way we could ultimately compute and reduce the amount of power we're using, and not just the PUE. I mean, the PUE are the quick wins for you and us as DC operators to reduce as much cooling and optimize cooling and reduce losses. But then also the internal consumption is obviously the biggest saver, and us as data center providers can't do that. It's the user and the compute power that ultimately makes the data center more carbon neutral, because solar panels and wind turbines don't improve the consumption of DCs. We still have to build those panels. To put those panels in place and the wind turbines, you've got huge amount of fuel. It makes a big carbon footprint automatically putting that stuff in place, for example. So the most efficient data center platform is, you can't really say an off one, But to reduce the amount of compute and optimizing what we do is obviously ultimately the most efficient DC, for example. But there are lots of technologies like solar, like wind. SA has now got a new wheeling agreement where you can actually put up a solar plant worth 100 megawatts, feed it through, and ultimately end up carbon neutral. But your requirements and your times and your base load ends up still being fossil fuel when you look at huge capacities like we're using in data center environments at the moment. So we have a lot of challenges. And talking about like hydrogen storage, in Africa, we're still trying to get our data centers on with diesel, for example, and gas. So the challenges that we have in Africa versus Europe and the States have significant differences, but I mean, we ultimately, I must say, Kenya is a good model to follow, but each of us have big challenges in our networks, and one big one I think is uptime and quality for our continent ultimately.
Yeah, no, thanks. Mark, if I could just get you to jump in on the same topic, right? I think you've become very involved in Africa, especially now from a design perspective as well. What do you, is there like specific trends? Are we changing the way we look at the design for Africa in particular, or is it basically following more international, bringing us in line, or, you know, what's just to add some color on that?
Yeah, so I think, you know, let's start off from a couple of the points that Menno made there. You know, we all need to consider energy, the way we use energy. Even if we do have renewable resources, we shouldn't be profligate with those resources. You know, we shouldn't just consume them because they're, you know, the right kind of resources to be using. So I think Menno makes a very, very good point. I think what we should all be doing in the industry is looking at the one in PUE. You know, the numbers after the decimal point become effectively a diminishing return. I think we're all capable of doing a good job in whatever part of the world we live in, of reducing the number after the one. What we need to be doing, I think, is focusing more on the one, and I think we also need to make it more clear to the media that actually it's not the building that's the problem. You know, if there's no IT load in the building doesn't consume any energy. Which is where PUE kind of falls down, really. You know, PUE is not an energy efficiency metric. But going back to what you're saying, though, I think, you know, Africa has probably a different set of problems. Yes, we talk about maybe the lack of quality of the power infrastructure and the low base load. But then if you look at trying to build a data center around London or in Dublin or in Amsterdam or even in Singapore at the moment, there isn't available power. It's very, very difficult to do it because the power is not available. And you've probably all heard about the energy crisis in the UK. So, you know, Africa is not by any means unique in having its problems. You know, we seem to be digging ourselves into a bit of a hole in the UK as well. So I think in terms of, to answer your question directly, Lodi, I'll be building different things in different locations. Well, we probably are to some degree because local ambient conditions are different. You know, Tunde made a very good point that, you know, high humidity, high temperature, you know, we can't necessarily build the same sort of data center in Africa or in Nigeria specifically as we would in, let's say, London or Dublin. You know, very, very different set of conditions. So I think we have to all be very, very aware that there's no such thing as a standard data center. Everybody has to build their local climatic conditions, but also their local market conditions. You know, different people in different parts of the world are probably looking for a different sort of thing. You know, you talk to your hyperscale customers versus your standard co-location customers, they're probably looking for slightly different things. If you're into retail versus wholesale, you're looking again at different things. So I think there are very much different sorts of data centers. And I think, you know, my one piece of advice would be there is no such thing as a standard data center. Look at the business requirements first. You know, understand your local market and ambient conditions and design to that. Don't just take a design that someone else has used in Amsterdam or Dublin. You know, that's not going to work, basically. So I think that's really important. And then I think the other thing is, you know, what sort of power is locally available? Green power is absolutely driving things. But then if you look at what's happening in probably, you know, Western Europe, Northern Europe, there's an awful lot of greenwashing. You know, power purchase agreements seem to be the way to go. We've got limited green power. So maybe in Africa, there's an advantage that you do have potentially more green power available. You know, you can actually leapfrog, I think, to some degree what we've done in more traditionally mature areas. And I think the one thing I would say, and it's probably a topic to discuss, is communities of interest. If the local grid isn't reliable or doesn't have the right sort of power on it, is it possible to create local communities of interest who have shared power requirements, microgrids, that sort of thing? Yes, high capital investment, but maybe one of the few alternatives, and then bringing in those intermittent power resources such as wind and solar, and supplementing them with other sorts of energy sources. So that'd be my sort of key takeaways, and largely agreeing with Menno, I guess.
Yeah, and that's exactly a point that I want to really dig into now, about that community or collective interest. But I just want to quickly jump over to Ranjit. Ranjit, you want to add in there?
Yeah, so I just wanted to, in the defense of the data center industry in general, I mean, I think the evolution we've had in computers and chips, where everything is now running from co-location data centers, where you're getting scale, is a far more efficient way of actually consuming data than the old traditional model, and people miss that point often. So what we are actually fundamentally doing is actually saving the planet by consolidating those resources, providing top-class PUE, versus everybody running little data centers and consuming it. I mean, as far as consuming data goes, it's like me trying to ration my son's McDonald's, trying to tell McDonald's you shouldn't be producing anymore. I think that's just a given. We've changed the way we live, even in Kenya and in many other places. We are quite data centric, and I feel it's far more efficient. COVID is a great example. I mean, who would have thought in Kenya government servants would be working from home, and efficiently so, just like we have in other parts of the world. That is for sure saved the environment many carbon dioxide molecules. The fact that it was also only possible because of data centers. So as much as we get shamed and slammed, I actually think we are providing an incredibly good service.
I think exactly to your point, right? The whole piece around moving it into a colo, right? I think we make ourselves a bigger target, because yes, we're doing it really efficiently, but we're doing it in a bigger scale, and we become a bigger problem, right? A bigger target. And I think that's really what I want to try and now sort of lead the conversation down in the next sort of few minutes. It's around, to Mark's point, more of a collective or community approach. I mean, we're getting to a point now, big operators looking at Africa, wanting to move in, the final frontier, the second gold rush, all these fancy titles that they're putting into Africa. But it just feels like we got more of probably a power provisioning conversation that's starting to take place, right? Because it's not just a single operator now looking for a large bit of power, right? It's actually, eventually we're going to start seeing sort of communities of operators, because that's where your fiber is, that's where your power is. So it's not just one person asking for power anymore. It could be a group of 5 to 10 mates, if you want to look at it that way, right? It's not just one person asking for 50 megawatts. It could be 10 people asking for 50 megawatts. So you've got a 500 megawatt conversation all of a sudden. So I mean, Mark, what's your view on that? I mean, we've had a lot of discussions around power provisioning. It's a bit of a different conversation, right? It's not a guarantee. You don't want to buy your 50 megawatts today over the table, right? You've got a business plan. You can scale. Is it very different in Africa, or are we going to face the same thing?
I think you to some degree you've got more opportunity in Africa. I mean, there's more reason to do it, to create that community of interest, because you're possibly less able to rely on the grid and the energy mix on that grid. It depends. I think it requires will from local authorities, local governments, etc., to actually do this, to actually pull those communities together and allow it to happen. And to support businesses, I think, in developing those ecosystems that are supporting. I mean, for instance, we routinely talk about reusing waste heat in data centers, and that clearly, if we can reuse the waste heat in data centers, then that would ultimately, from a net perspective, reduce the carbon output and the energy usage. It's clearly the right thing to do, but there's no way actually you can do that unless you have a customer for that heat. And again, it's not just about creating the shared demand for energy. It's about what you do with that energy once it's been not consumed necessarily, because we don't really truly consume energy, we use it. But taking that waste heat and doing something useful with it would be a huge benefit. But it won't happen unless we have that community of interest. There's plenty of schemes in again, Western Europe that people have said, we've got this waste heat, but nobody's taking advantage of it particularly because, nobody really wants it. And nobody wants it because they're not close enough or they don't have the right businesses nearby to take advantage. So again, there's all sorts of potential benefits coming from those communities, but we have to do a better job of from a planning perspective, from a government perspective, from a local authority perspective of bringing those or allowing those communities to come together. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges we face. And maybe Africa can do a better job than we do in, again, more traditional areas.
Yeah, and I'm just thinking Africa now. I don't think we got the best sort of examples that from governmental authority level that they're going to drive this probably and make it all happen. I think, Thandi, I'll probably pull you in on from an ADCA perspective here. I mean, we've really got an opportunity. I think I really like this collective or joint approach or, mass power. I mean, we really have an opportunity to actually, make it happen. I love the leapfrog analogy. For Africa. I mean, from an ADCA perspective, is this a real opportunity for us to really have these government conversations and drive this culture?
Yes, it is, and it's a subject that we are looking at and discussing as well, because the key thing is how can we drive the right actions at the top level. The challenge is Africa is not the same in it's a huge continent, and we've got to start the discussion somewhere. And also, you've got very high humidity and so on in places. Ranjit will tell you also, with respect to his experience in Kenya, the climate is totally different as well, even between Kenya, Nairobi and Mombasa. So we've discussed that as well. But nevertheless, it doesn't take us away from taking on the challenge of how do we energy Africa. There's a body called Re-Energy Africa, for instance, that's really looking at how the energy issue in Africa and how you can leapfrog, how you can bring in opportunities for green energy. But at the same time, the realities or practicalities of, to industrialize Africa, you have to, get energy working across the board. So when we're looking at educating, Ranjit's made a very strong point, and it's something that we look at the ADCA. If you look at data center energy consumption in the whole world, it's less than what you would have in a typical country, for instance. But nevertheless, what we're doing is shifting operating patterns of flying, of not driving around the place, of having concentrated points, of driving efficiency that makes it in total much more efficient for the use of power. You have a concentrated point where you can drive efficiency and drive the right kind of availability of power. So we want to see how we can get the right kind of recognition of the benefits of the data center community across the continent, recognition of the fact that we've got to put in the right kind of policies that will enable the delivery of power. We'll use the example of France, for instance, where you have tax breaks, but then you kind of link it to other aspects of ethical sort of behaviors, and so on and so forth. So we're looking at how can we use examples like that and make it relevant to Africa. And in the membership, I think we've got some members here of the ADCA. It's something that we have started to engage the entire membership into looking at. It's not just around Energy Africa, which we say there's an opportunity to leapfrog in technology. In mobile telephony, we've leapfrogged in many ways. In banking and fintech, we've leapfrogged in many ways. We have to digitize Africa as well, and do it in conjunction with the Energy Africa agenda. And so we say, okay, how do we get the optimum mix between digitizing Africa, Energy Africa? Because even if we power digitization, what about the rest of industry that needs to consume the digital stuff? We still need to figure out how to power them as well. So it's a complicated issue, but one thing we started to tackle and think about how best to break it down to make it specific to all of the operators in Africa that are members of the Africa Data Center Association.
Thanks. Brendan, I think you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, look, I think if we look at Africa as a whole, it's such an untapped resource from a data center point of view. If we also engage with governments and maybe, individually as well, from country to country, is just for them to understand the potential with the hyperscalers coming into the country. I mean, the job creation around that. I think it's not waiting for it being too late to realize, the infrastructure is completely gone. What do you do then? It's engaging early enough to try and fight this battle. And certainly coming together as groups of companies, like, go back 10 years ago, let's go to Slough in the UK, independent power producer with their power station. Are we at the point where we start saying, right, guys, there's a particular area that we're looking at? Do we come together as groups of data center providers to say, right, let's look at something outside of the government control, with the independent power producers, we're given that opportunity now.
No, and exactly that, right? And it pretty much leads me to the point. I just wanted to, Ranjit, I wanted to come to you on this one, right? I wanted to, yes, independent power, but also the whole green power piece, because we know that the global players, the big hyperscalers, are going to focus on, they want the green tech, right? Because they're doing it at great and good low PUE, but like we said earlier, they're the biggest scale, so that the biggest targets are on their back, right? Have you seen any benefit in Kenya purely just based on the green power availability?
No, not really.
Polo hyperscaler?
It's not a conversation they are actually expecting, and I think it's lack of knowledge perhaps, but it's also subscale. So I think in South Africa you probably have a better conversation. I mean, we just don't have multi-megawatts being consumed at this point that it's relevant. So if you have a small edge installation for 100 kilowatts, yeah, it's nice, but it's nothing that moves the needle. So they're not interested. I think on the independent power piece, I mean, to Menno's point, actually, yeah, we can say and do all of this, but we just don't have the scale at which South Africa operates at, and we're talking about literally 30 times, 40 times what we currently do today. And it's actually just simply down to demand. Today the grid makes more energy than we're able to consume as a country. So, 2013, there was only 15% electrification. We're close to 90% now. So there's been big strides in the last 7-8 years. And I think to your other question around the independent power producers, we will just never have enough capital to invest in the power sector to keep up with the 50 million people. So a big piece of that missing component is, what South Africa has done, where somebody's built a 100 megawatt plant and they're able to use a wheeling agreement to send it across halfway across the country. We're just not there. And that is actually critical in being able to provide or have a sustained model for green energy, because consumption will increase, which of course means investment in the grid. And then at some point it'll catch up. So the only way to plug that, frankly, is the IPP. Now, I don't want to sound too political, but it's not in the government's best interest to do that when you basically have a monopoly operator, as you have in South Africa, in Kenya, in many other parts. Nigeria is ahead of the game there because they have privatized that, but still don't seem to be able to get their act together. I mean, so I think, as we're all saying, it's not so straightforward, but without the IPPs coming out, third parties making investments, we're dead in the water at some point in the future.
And I think I'm glad you brought that up, Brendan. I'm going to come to you next. I think we've had this conversation about this whole 100 megawatt plant, right? I think we're having two different conversations here. Ranjit, you've got the infrastructure, you need to build more. but I think we've got an infrastructure, but I'm not sure how well we can use it, right? Brendan, I think we were talking about how to physically get this flow through, right, into Joburg, let's say.
Yeah, Menno mentioned it early on as well with the wheeling agreements, and I think with the IPP band that's been opened up a bit now to that 100 megawatts allowance, certainly starts making the space a little more interesting and exciting. From our experience as Terraco, look, so you try and use whatever you can from a solar point of view, renewable energy, but when you start looking at larger values, your 10s, 20s, 100 megawatts at a time, dealing with somebody in the Northern Cape to use Eskom's core infrastructure to then wheel it back through in the Johannesburg area, it's still quite new. In my view, it's the challenge is still the fact that it's not quite as mature as what it probably is in Kenya, where all the infrastructure is there, but the power usage isn't there. And we'd love to take some of that power on. It would be great, but yeah, I think we've got to allow this market, especially in the South African context, to mature. But it's certainly there. The challenge then becomes when we go into the solar and the wind can the actual backbone of the utility provider actually cater for those wheeling agreements? I mean, I think there's still a lot of infrastructure work that needs to be done in the back end as well.
I think, Menno, I mean, in terms of this wheeling agreement, how far do you think we are really to actually be implementing or benefiting?
Yeah, so I mean, the government speaks about it and it's great in the media, and then when you start approaching, I want like 10 of that somewhere, you don't understand the amount of paperwork, and you actually need a data center to process the paperwork to be able to generate that wheeling agreement. It's crazy. So in principle, let's say the government goes and puts a structure in place, and there's this thing called our utility, like NEPA and in Kenya, Eskom is, let's say, the base grid or base infrastructure carrier. And as soon as you might get different DCs in different munis, all of a sudden the power is their cash cow, for example. So the plan is to get the wheeling agreement, let's say, from Oudtshoorn, which is the sunniest place on earth, and all these solar panels out there, but now you sit in a certain little muni and he makes more money out of you than he does for all sorts of other things. And all of a sudden you come and say, I need a wheeling agreement into my little PowerPoint, and I want to buy it from somewhere else, and I'm only going to pay transport rights. All of a sudden you catch, there's so many wobblies en route, and the legislation and this paperwork and that paperwork. So the principle is great. And what that nearly shows is you need to be a community of DCs in a specific region that's totally separate from a municipality, and you can collaborate and say, let's put together a 50 meg or 100 meg plant together, and you eliminate a lot of that red tape. And so PPAs are reasonably easy to achieve because they've gone through all the, but to have your own wheeling agreement in place is still, there are a lot of challenges that come with that. If you look, what is a really great thing, I was in Ethiopia the other day, and they're building a few DCs in the RCT park, and the government's actually put together a great place where these communities are all together in a similar, but it has its own risk. Ultimately, you need some kind of mirrored site somewhere else. But the collaboration where DCs can actually get together, put together infrastructure in place that suits them properly, and go carbon zero, exactly, if there's ever a dream like that. But that principle and those concepts of wheeling to take that for one DC operator is quite difficult, even though they've made it. They've said it's the highway, but it's quite a bumpy highway. It's a Nigerian road over there.
Yeah.
And I think that really gets back to that point, right? There's a lot of activity in Africa, right? We see it from CBRE perspective in our advisory transaction business. We talk to global operators that want to move in. We can see everyone knows now on this call, and people looking in. We've seen massive investment in Africa. We see big data centers being built, data centers that we didn't think Africa would have seen, right? We're talking in the big 10s, 20s, 30 megawatts. I mean, we've seen land get taken up for 100 megawatt. So we're going to get big players, and we're going to get a lot of big players. I mean, the thoughts of really sticking together, and I keep using the analogy, it's 10 mates that you meet in the bar, right? We're all trying to buy the same thing. Why don't we go to the same location, get all these data centers sort of kitted out, and we pretty much, in a way, which it's a little bit selfish because the data center market is sorting it out for themselves, but also giving the opportunity for local infrastructure to not have to feed the need for all this, because the data centers are not going to stop, right? We're not going to stop building and stop housing these data centers because there's a power infrastructure. I think, Thande, to your point, there's always another way to run it, right? There's a diesel, there's a gas option that we're going to always power these, but how do we do it responsibly as a collective? And I really, it's been really sticking in a lot of conversations the last few weeks. I mean, Mark, what do you see as in the mature markets? I mean, talking Slough or wherever in Europe, there's a cluster, right? Is there, do they do any sort of individual power programs, or is it all sort of the PPA?
No, I mean, I think as Menno mentioned earlier, Slough had the advantage of a power station, almost a dedicated power station to the area, which was a privately run power station, which was using renewable fuels latterly. Slough Estates, I think, have actually sold it off, which makes no sense whatsoever, but they have. So, I do think that can work, but the capital investment is huge. And you're absolutely right. We're only going to see more data centers. There's a bit of an irony with governments. On the one hand, they seem to be quick to criticize the power consumption of the sector, and are in some areas, certainly in Europe, talking about legislation, potentially some form of taxation around data center operations. But we all are going to consume more digital services, and I think African nations in particular, there's going to be a very rapid growth in the demand for digital services and the infrastructure that's required to support that. And I think you're also seeing greater focus from every country on the planet on data sovereignty. Governments want to own or host the data for their citizens in their country. And I think, again, that's going to be an absolute driver for every country on the planet, including Africa. So I think when you start throwing those things together, you're going to see growth for digital services, which are obviously hosted in data centers. The irony is that every government on the planet is requiring more services for their citizens, and including delivering their own services to their citizens, and yet are potentially prepared to criticize the increase in power consumption by data centers. And that's a conversation that needs to be had with every government on the planet, frankly. They can't have it both ways, guys. If you want to reduce data center consumption, we can all go back to the Middle Ages, but I don't think anybody really wants that.
Yeah, it seems like the point. Be careful what you ask for, right? You want your data in the country, but you're going to realize now you're going to have to run it.
Yeah, absolutely right.
Maybe it changes the other way around, right? Send the data back to Ireland, let them run it.
I'm sure they'd be happy with that, but it's not very practical.
Yeah, so I'm just conscious we're pretty much getting to time. I just want to allow sort of any other comments on any other points around a more of a collaborative, collective approach with all our incoming new visitors or new guests, let's say, and our local big players.
Yeah. Can I add sort of one thing? IPPs, independent power provision, and power purchase agreements are going to be a way of life for us as operators. It's inevitable. If you have a utility provider who's providing about 100 megawatts, for instance, and you're going to say I need 30 megawatts over the next 3-year timescale, given the growth we're seeing. Yeah, it's a huge implementation for them, and you start to get into PPAs. I mean, you look at the comparisons of building something that's suited to what your requirements are. And we talked about having clusters of data center providers together, but the reality is this: enterprises also want disaster recovery of miles apart. The hyperscalers want to see if there's a location somewhere, there's a second location somewhere else, and perhaps even a third. Brendan's experience in South Africa sort of probably shows that. So you don't have just one cluster, you have a variety of clusters, but certain aspects of risk starts to tell you, even that, is it appropriate? Mark talked about the fact that even in the UK now, the size of demand for power isn't something you just switch on. Probably blow a fuse somewhere along the line. It's something you've got to really plan with the power providers, whether it's gas, whether it's from private gas, or whether it's a utility, or whether it's a combination of solar with wind. We're going to have to find the energy mix that works in the most practical ways, but we have to figure out the power purchase type of agreements that we need, the independent power type of solutions that we need, but make it as collective as possible, maybe not necessarily to other data center providers, but other communities around us that need to use some of that power. And those are the kind of conundrums we're having to deal with, actually, not that we're going to have to deal with. As you're scaling, you're going to have to deal with it. And also, how do you link the power you're producing and consuming to being able to, if, for instance, you had a corporate action and so on, you're not locked into certain agreements and stuff like that. While it's great to share the power, but then, are you going to lock yourself into the wrong kind of agreements? These are challenges we have to take on, we are taking on, and we're going to have to continue to take on, given the locations that we're at, wherever we are in Africa.
And it just feels to me that we've got one problem to resolve, right? So once yes, we're very different in all our locations, but I think once we've resolved the solution, we pretty much can push it out through Africa, right? It just seems like no matter how we look at it, either have everyone trying to resolve it on their own, or we basically come up with the solution and then we jump to the whole leapfrog, please. I love the Africa Leapfrog Association. Just resolve it early, right? So it just feels like we're in that stage now before we're hitting this big wave. If we can actually get some sense around this and a suitable workaround, we probably change, and we would, I think the mature markets would be looking at Africa and congratulating us, right? Right. Anyone else want to add anything?
I think if you want, Lee, just going back to that community of interest, I think if you can create an area that has the right kind of power, stable power, it has good fiber connectivity, and available land at the right price, then people will come along. And it's Slough didn't happen because people said Slough was the best place to go. It just so happened it had everything that it was needed. It had the right power, it had available power, it had connectivity, it was close to London. So, if anybody wants to create or bring data center operators into a region, then they create that environment. And if local authorities, governments, whatever can do that, then they'll have customers wherever you are in the world, frankly.
Latency and sovereign data and scale and broadband penetration makes Africa inevitable. Yep. It's as an inevitable end location, and its practicalities, and that'll bring the scale into Africa. And we're going to have to figure out how to deliver the energy to deliver that scale for the good of the whole. Ranjit mentioned what we do is not about just what we do. It's the total benefit that we need to consider, and it's a significant benefit to the ecosystems we operate in. Finally, for every dollar that's spent in data center infrastructure, analysis, I think by Bain about 7 years ago, showed you have 100 times benefit into the economy and economic ecosystem. So if you're spending, even if it's 15 million or whatever it is, $10 million per megawatt, the impact on the economic environment is 100-fold. You're building stuff, you're maintaining stuff, you're shipping stuff in, you're causing local manufacturing. We've started to talk about Keep It Africa as an initiative, which means that you have a value in supply chain locally to deliver a lot of stuff you need to make it more efficient. That's 100-fold impact on economic activity, which in itself is, something quite remarkable.
No, 100% agree. I think when I've had a few conversations with friends and they doom and gloom about Africa, and then you're talking data centers and they just see growth, and then well, how does the continent actually, the infrastructure going to manage this? I mean, that's what data centers are going to bring. I'm not saying data centers is the answer, but it's in the root of everything. Once you got a digital ecosystem, you got roads, you got, everything improves around it because there's just investment coming in from all different angles. I mean, agricultural, health service, and everything. So yeah. So I really hope that this conversation is really going to continue. I think we've had a really healthy viewpoint. We've definitely got it from all angles. I think the census is definitely a collective approach, especially when we got global players moving in. With also global views, but we got local infrastructure knowledge, and as a collective approach, I just hope to see this conversation just keep building. So I just want to say thank you to all our panelists. I really appreciate you taking the time. It's really important obviously for the continent and digitizing Africa. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Lee.
Thank you very much.
Thanks,
everybody.
Cheers all.
Ladies and gentlemen, we trust you enjoyed the session. Thank you to all our sponsors and partners for helping us bring this event to you. Please click on the next link to join the following session.